and welcome back to another quiet journey into the past. Tonight, we'll be wandering through the kitchens, fields, and banquet halls of medieval Ireland, where food was more than just a way to fill the belly. It was survival, community, and sometimes even a sacred act. From the humble peasant boiling barley into thick pottage, to the noble feasting on roasted meats under candlelight, every dish carried a story. Every bite revealed something about the world they lived in. Food was tied to festivals, to faith, to the cycles of the land, and the fragile balance between hunger and plenty. So, let your mind drift now, as we leave behind the noise of the present and step softly into the past. Imagine the smoke rising from turf fires, the sound of ale being poured into wooden cups, and the comforting scent of bread baking on stone. Settle in, find your rest, and allow the story of medieval Irish food, from peasant to king, to guide you gently into sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the rolling green hills of medieval Ireland. The air is cool and damp, carrying with it the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. It is early morning, and a soft mist still lingers over the fields, clinging to the heather and the grass. For most people in this land, life is deeply tied to the earth beneath their feet. The soil, though sometimes rocky, is the great provider. It yields oats and barley, beans and peas, and the occasional patch of vegetables carefully tended near the doorway of a humble hut. This is the foundation of medieval Irish food, not luxury or excess, but survival, grown from the sweat of calloused hands and the rhythm of the seasons. Farming is not a profession for the few. It is the occupation of nearly everyone. Almost every household, from peasant to noble, relies on the cycles of planting, harvesting, and storing to ensure there is food enough to last through the long year. Picture a peasant farmer in the early 13th century. He bends low in his small field, sowing oats, his most dependable crop. Oats grow well in the damp climate, more reliable than wheat, which struggles in the heavy Irish soil. These oats will later become the porridge and bread that sustain his family. Beside the fields, barley is also planted, destined for ale making, while beans and peas provide extra nourishment. Around the modest dwelling, his wife tends to a small garden patch. Onions, leeks, perhaps some cabbage, all simple but vital additions to their diet. In the yard, a few chickens scratch the dirt, offering eggs, and maybe a pig waits to be fattened for slaughter when the colder months arrive. For this peasant family, food is never guaranteed. Every bite is earned by the steady rhythm of labor, digging, planting, harvesting, preserving. Yet, there is a certain quiet satisfaction in knowing that what they grow with their own hands will keep them alive. The rhythm of agriculture is not only practical, but spiritual. Medieval Irish life is deeply intertwined with the church, and farming seasons are guided by both the calendar of the land and the calendar of the saints. Fields are often blessed before planting. Harvests are offered up in prayer. The success or failure of crops is thought to rest not just on weather or soil, but on divine favor. During planting, Families look anxiously to the skies. Too much rain, and the crops rot in the ground. Too little, and the earth cracks and withers. Every family knows the memory of hunger, the fear of harvests gone wrong. Yet the turning of the seasons continues, and with each spring there is hope that the earth will once again give its bounty. The peasants who labor on their knees in muddy fields are not only working for survival, but also offering a humble act of faith, trusting that their toil will be blessed with nourishment. Livestock plays its own role in this cycle of survival. Cows are among the most prized animals in medieval Ireland, not only for meat, but for milk, butter, and cheese, foods that keep for longer and add richness to otherwise plain meals. A household that owns a good dairy cow is thought of as fortunate. Sheep provide wool for clothing, but their milk and meat are also welcome supplements. Pigs, though harder to keep, are valued for their fat and meat, which can be salted or smoked for preservation. Chickens and geese provide eggs, which are especially important during the fasting seasons when meat is forbidden. Animals are rarely slaughtered casually. They are too valuable. To kill a cow or a pig is a decision carefully considered, often tied to feast days, payments of rent, or survival through the winter. Thus, the sound of animals in a medieval Irish village is not just background noise. It is the heartbeat of survival. The landscape itself shapes what people can eat. Ireland's damp climate favors certain crops, while discouraging others. Wheat, the grain most prized across medieval Europe for fine white bread, struggles here. And so it is reserved for the wealthy few who can afford imported flour. For the majority, darker loaves made from oats and barley are the daily bread. Rivers and streams offer fish, though these two are often claimed as rights of the nobility or the church, leaving peasants to make do with what they can catch in secret. The sea provides another source of food: shellfish, seaweed, and the occasional larger catch. In many ways, the Irish diet is shaped not by choice, but by necessity, by what the land and water allow. There is beauty in this, but also hardship, for when the land fails, hunger soon follows. Imagine now the cycle of a single year in this medieval world. In spring, the earth softens and the first planting begins. Families rise early, working together to sow oats and barley before the rains. By summer, fields are alive with green shoots, and hope grows with them. Come autumn, the harvest begins, a frantic and exhausting season where every hand is needed to gather, thresh, and store the grains. Winter, then, is the true test. Families huddle by their hearths, rationing the oats, bread, and salted meat, praying it will last until spring returns. This cycle repeats year after year, tying families to the land, teaching patience, endurance, and humility before nature's power. In such a life, food is never taken for granted. Each meal carries the weight of labor, weather, and the fragile balance of survival. Yet, even in hardship, there is comfort to be found. A warm bowl of porridge shared with family on a cold morning, the smell of fresh bread baking on a hearthstone, or the simple richness of butter spread over a slice. These small moments give meaning to the endless labor. The medieval Irish peasant knows hunger, but also gratitude. The act of eating is not just nourishment, but reassurance, proof that the family has endured another day. As we begin this journey into medieval Irish food, we start not with kings or nobles, but with the humble fields and the hard-working peasants who tilled them. For it is in their soil, their sweat, and their meager meals that the true foundations of Irish food culture are laid. Step now into the heart of a medieval Irish peasant's home. It is not a grand hall or even a spacious dwelling, but a small, one-room hut with a thatched roof and rough walls of wattle and daub. Smoke curls upward from the hearth, which sits at the center of the room, its fire providing both warmth and a place for cooking. The floor is packed earth, strewn with straw, and around the edges of the room are simple wooden stools and perhaps a bench. Here, in this humble space, meals are shared. They are not feasts of plenty, but modest gatherings where survival is measured in bread and porridge, not delicacies. The table itself may be no more than a plank set across trestles, yet it is the center of family life, the place where the day begins and ends. To sit at this table is to understand the reality of medieval Irish food. Simple, repetitive, and unadorned, but deeply tied to the rhythms of life. The most common meal for peasants is porridge, known to them as stirabout. Made from oats boiled in water or milk, it is thick, filling, and endlessly adaptable. In the morning, a family might eat it plain, each spoonful a warm comfort against the chill of dawn. At other times, if milk is available, it might be made richer and creamier, or flavored with a little honey if fortune smiles. For most peasants, however, porridge is not variety, but constancy. It appears at every mealtime in one form or another. Alongside it is bread, coarse, dark loaves baked from oats or barley, often heavy and dense. Unlike the fine white bread reserved for nobles, peasant bread is sturdy and practical, meant to last and to fill. Butter, when there is enough to spare, is spread on the bread in small amounts, its richness transforming even the simplest slice into a moment of delight. In these small meals, sustenance and survival merge. Cheese, too, has its place on the peasant table. Made from cow's milk or sometimes from sheep and goats, it is both nourishing and long-lasting. Families often make their own, pressing curds into simple wheels that can be stored for weeks. A wedge of cheese, a crust of bread, and perhaps a jug of thin ale might form a midday meal, taken quickly before returning to work in the fields. Eggs, gathered from hens or ducks, appear when they can be spared from hatching. Boiled or fried over the hearth, they are welcome additions to the otherwise plain diet. Meat, however, is rare. A peasant family might slaughter a chicken now and then, or eat pork from a pig fattened for winter, but most days pass without it. Instead, peasants rely on dairy and grains, foods that sustain them with steady familiarity. Though meager, these meals are filling enough to carry them through the long hours of labor. Ale is the drink of choice for many peasants, brewed at home from barley. It is not the strong ale of later centuries, but a weak, nourishing beverage, safer than water and rich in calories. Children drink it as readily as adults, for clean water is not always guaranteed. Milk, when not churned into butter or made into cheese, is also consumed, though often reserved for the youngest in the family. Watered down whey, the liquid left after cheese making, becomes another common drink. These liquids, though simple, provide essential nourishment. At mealtimes, they are poured into rough clay cups or wooden mugs, passed around the table as the family eats together. Eating is never solitary in a peasant household. It is a communal act, an affirmation of togetherness. In the flickering light of the hearth, family members share their porridge and bread, each bite a reminder of their dependence on both land and one another. Cooking is a straightforward affair. Over the central fire, an iron pot hangs from a chain, filled with oats, beans, or vegetables simmering slowly. Sometimes, meat scraps or bones are added, creating a broth that flavors the meal, but more often it is a vegetarian fare, hearty but plain. Wooden spoons stir constantly, preventing burning, while the smoke of the hearth gives food a distinct, earthy flavor. Bread is baked on flat stones or simple griddles, its crust darkened by the fire. Nothing is wasted. Vegetable peels are thrown into the pot. Milk that sours becomes cheese, and leftover porridge is fried into oat cakes the next morning. In this way, peasants live not only frugally but resourcefully, turning every scrap of food into nourishment. There is no room for indulgence, but there is skill in making the most of little, a quiet creativity that keeps hunger at bay. Meals are not measured by courses, but by necessity. A morning meal might consist of porridge and bread, eaten quickly before work begins in the fields. At midday, bread with cheese and ale sustains the workers, often eaten outdoors in the fields themselves. The main meal, taken in the evening when the day's work is done, is the heartiest. More porridge, perhaps stew if vegetables or meat are available, eaten together at the table by firelight. This rhythm repeats itself day after day, steady and unchanging. The simplicity of these meals may seem monotonous to modern tastes, yet to medieval peasants, they were enough. Food was not judged by variety, but by its ability to fill the belly and give strength for the next day's labor. And in this way, the peasant table became the quiet anchor of survival, its plain meals serving as both sustenance and comfort. There is, however, a deep cultural meaning attached to even the simplest food. To break bread together is to affirm bonds of family and community. Guests, however humble, are offered what little the household can spare, for hospitality is a sacred duty in Irish tradition. Even a poor family will share their porridge or slice of bread with a visitor, believing that generosity invites blessings in return. At times of hardship, neighbors come together to share food, pooling what they have to ensure survival. In these moments, food becomes more than nourishment. It becomes a symbol of solidarity. And so, though the peasant table may appear bare to modern eyes, it carries a richness beyond flavor. a richness of meaning, of faith, and of fellowship. As the warm days of harvest fade and the winds grow colder, the people of medieval Ireland turn their thoughts to survival. For the peasant, autumn is not merely a season of golden fields and gathering crops. It is a race against time. Every stalk of grain must be cut, every root pulled from the ground, every animal prepared for the long, unforgiving months ahead. In this world, food is not a daily purchase from a market stall, but a fragile stockpile built with sweat and hope. The harvest is both relief and anxiety. Relief that the earth has provided again, and anxiety that the stores may still not be enough. Winter lies ahead, long and lean, and the memory of hunger is never far. For generations, families have learned the painful truth: what is not preserved now will be lost, and what is lost may mean empty bowls before spring returns. The methods of preservation are simple, but they are the difference between plenty and famine. Grains, the foundation of the diet, are dried and stored in wicker bins or clay vessels, tucked safely in huts or pits dug into the earth. Oats and barley, if kept dry, will last the winter, providing porridge and bread. Meat, far rarer, requires special care. Pigs slaughtered in autumn are cut into joints, the fat rendered into lard, and the flesh salted heavily or smoked over slow fires. This salted pork becomes one of the few reliable sources of protein for the months ahead. Fish, too, can be dried or smoked, particularly along the coast where the sea offers its bounty. Butter, rich and precious, is sealed in wooden casks or even buried in bogs, where the cool, oxygen-poor environment preserves it for months. These techniques, handed down through generations, form a quiet wisdom that keeps families alive when the world outside grows barren. Yet no amount of preparation can fully silence the fear of hunger. Winter is always uncertain. If the harvest has been poor, if disease has struck the cattle, if rains have spoiled the grain, then even the best laid stores will prove inadequate. Families begin the winter with full bins and barrels, but as the weeks pass, the portions grow smaller. What was once a bowl of porridge might be reduced to half, and butter that once spread across bread becomes a rare luxury, saved for feast days. The cold gnaws at the body, and so does the emptiness of the stomach. Children feel it most, their cries of hunger weighing heavily on weary parents. And always there is the shadow of famine, the whispered stories of winters past when whole villages starved, when neighbors were forced to beg or steal. In such times, food is not just nourishment, it is survival itself, the fragile line between life and death. The church, too, influences how food is managed, especially through its rules of fasting. On Fridays, and during long periods of Lent, meat is forbidden, forcing peasants to rely even more heavily on fish, dairy, and grains. For wealthier households, this is an inconvenience. For peasants, it can be a hardship. Yet these fasts are endured with patience, seen as acts of devotion as well as discipline. The scarcity of food during winter makes the practice both practical and spiritual. Eating less becomes a way of enduring necessity with dignity. Sometimes the church eases the burden, allowing eggs or dairy where meat is forbidden, but the rhythm of fasting and feasting shapes the calendar of food. Even in hunger, peasants find meaning, believing that their sacrifice brings them closer to God. In this way, the struggle of winter is not merely physical but spiritual, a test of both body and soul. Communal bonds often soften the edge of hunger. Villages share resources where they can, lending a sack of oats or a portion of butter to a neighbor in need, knowing that someday the favor will be returned. In especially harsh winters, entire communities pool their stores, cooking great pots of porridge to feed many families at once. These acts of generosity are not always enough, but they remind people that they are not alone in their struggle. Stories are told by the fire, songs sung to distract from the emptiness of stomachs. Hospitality remains a duty, even in hardship, though what a host can offer may be little more than a crust of bread or a ladle of thin stew. Still, in the sharing of food, there is warmth. Hunger may be the common enemy, but community is the shield that lessens its sting. For children, winter is remembered in sensations. The sharp bite of cold air when stepping outside, the smoky scent of peat burning in the hearth, and the anticipation of mealtime, no matter how small the meal may be. A piece of cheese feels like a treasure, a slice of bread like a gift. Even the simple sweetness of honey, when it appears, is cause for celebration. Parents, though often weary, try to preserve joy for their children, telling stories during meals, encouraging laughter in the dim glow of the fire. In this way, food becomes not only sustenance but comfort, a thread of hope stretched across the darkness of winter. Each day survived is a small victory, and each meal a reminder that spring, though distant, will one day return. As the days grow longer and the frost finally begins to melt, the tension of winter slowly lifts. The bins are nearly empty, the salted pork reduced to scraps, but the promise of new growth is on the horizon. Families look to the fields, ready to begin the cycle again. The struggle has been endured, hunger has not defeated them, and there is a renewed sense of gratitude for the earth's return to life. In this way, the memory of winter shapes every meal that follows. Even the humblest porridge is precious when one remembers the lean months, and bread tastes sweeter when it is plentiful again. Preservation, hunger, and endurance are not merely aspects of medieval life. They are teachers, instilling humility, patience, and appreciation. To live through a winter in medieval Ireland is to carry within oneself both the memory of hardship and the deep joy of survival. In medieval Ireland, food was not only sustenance, it was also a marker of class and status. While the peasants scraped together meals of oats, dairy, and vegetables, the noble table told a different story. Bread, meat, and wine were more than flavors. They were symbols of wealth, privilege, and power. A noble's meal was a performance of authority, a visible reminder that they were set apart from the common folk who tilled their land. The very ingredients themselves revealed the gulf between classes. Where the poor ate barley bread, dense and coarse, nobles consumed fine white bread made from wheat, a grain that grew less readily in Ireland's climate and therefore carried prestige. To sit at a lord's table and see such loaves served was to be reminded of his wealth and reach, for wheat often had to be imported at great expense. Thus, the difference between bread and bread became the difference between poverty and nobility, between the ordinary and the exalted. If bread marked refinement, meat was the true symbol of nobility. While peasants might only taste pork or beef on feast days, nobles enjoyed it regularly. Their tables groaned with roasted joints of venison, beef, pork, and mutton. Hunting, an exclusive privilege of the upper classes, provided much of this meat. Deer, boar, and game birds were reserved for lords, both as sport and as proof of their dominion over land and forest. The feast of a noble household was as much about spectacle as nourishment. Roasted swans with feathers reattached for decoration, or peacocks presented whole with iridescent plumage. Meat was not eaten in silence. It was displayed, admired, and shared as a demonstration of wealth and hospitality. Even the fat of animals, rendered into dripping or lard, symbolized abundance. To be full of meat was to live above the hunger of the common folk, to partake in a luxury that few could imagine tasting daily. The noble table was not only rich in meat, but also diverse in preparation. Cooks employed by lords were skilled in spicing, roasting, boiling, and baking, transforming simple ingredients into elaborate dishes. Imported spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves found their way into noble kitchens, brought across seas at great expense. Their presence elevated dishes far beyond the reach of peasants, whose meals were plain and unseasoned. A venison stew laced with pepper or a sweet pastry dusted with cinnamon was not only a treat for the tongue, but also a signal of a household's wealth and connections. Wine, too, flowed at noble feasts, often imported from France, for Ireland's climate was not suited to vineyards. Where the peasant drank ale, thin and mild, the nobles sipped wine in silver goblets. Every sip was a taste of faraway lands, of trade networks and wealth that tied the Irish nobility into the wider European world. Bread and meat were also tools of hierarchy within the noble household itself. At great feasts, the lord and lady sat at the high table, where the finest wheat bread and choicest cuts of meat were served. Below them, lesser guests received barley bread and cheaper cuts, while servants and retainers were fed the scraps. The meal itself became a social map, each dish carefully placed to reflect rank. Even among nobles, status determined the food one received. A knight might enjoy pork and mutton, but venison or swan was reserved for those closest to the lord. Thus, dining was never a private act, but a public declaration of one's place in the order of things. Every bite reinforced the structure of medieval society, reminding all who ate that food was not simply nourishment. It was power, and power was always on display. Hospitality was central to the noble diet. A lord's reputation was not measured only in battles fought or lands owned, but in how generously he fed his guests. Great halls were designed for feasting, with long wooden tables stretching into the shadows, lit by torchlight and fire. When guests arrived, the hall came alive with music, conversation, and the smell of roasting meat. To refuse a guest food was unthinkable, a shame upon the household. Instead, nobles sought to overwhelm their visitors with abundance. Bread laid in baskets, meat piled high, flagons of ale and wine passed down the table. These feasts reinforced alliances, honored kinship, and secured loyalty. To eat at a noble's table was to be bound into a relationship of obligation and respect. Food was not just hospitality, it was diplomacy, politics, and the glue that held noble society together. For the peasants who occasionally glimpsed such feasts, the experience must have been dazzling. To see a roasted goose presented whole, or sweet pastries made with honey and spices, was to enter another world. The smells, the laughter, the glitter of silverware, these were far removed from the dim cottages where meals were humble and quiet. Some peasants, serving as cooks, scullions, or musicians, witnessed the noble diet up close, though they ate little of it themselves. Leftovers might trickle down, bones boiled into thin stews or crusts of bread given as charity. Yet even these scraps carried the flavor of luxury. For many, the noble feast was a story to tell long after, a memory that highlighted the gulf between their world and that of their masters. And yet, despite the wealth of the noble diet, it was not without danger. Excessive meat, rich pastries, and sweet wines led to ailments unknown to peasants, who rarely had such abundance. Gout, known as the disease of kings, afflicted nobles who feasted too often on red meat and wine. Doctors and monks warned against gluttony, urging moderation even in times of plenty. The church reminded nobles that indulgence was a sin and that charity should temper luxury. Still, the lure of roasted venison or spiced wine was hard to resist. Feasts continued, and the noble diet remained a marker of privilege, even as it brought its own burdens. In this way, the noble table reflected both the heights of wealth and the pitfalls of excess, a mirror of medieval life itself, at once splendid and precarious. Ultimately, bread, meat, and status were woven into the very identity of medieval Irish nobility. To eat richly was to live richly, to prove oneself above the hunger and simplicity of the common folk. Yet food was never only about appetite. It was about display, ritual, and hierarchy. A loaf of wheat bread was more than grain. It was a statement. A joint of venison was more than nourishment. It was power. The noble diet revealed the values of the age, where class distinctions were tasted as well as seen, and where every feast was both a celebration and a performance. In the flickering firelight of a great hall, with music echoing and wine flowing, one could taste the medieval world itself, layered with meaning, divided by status, and bound together by the rituals of food. The rhythm of medieval Irish life was not only measured by toil and hunger, but also by those rare moments when the community came together in joy, celebration, and relief. Festivals punctuated the long, weary months of agricultural work, giving peasants and nobles alike a chance to rest, to share, and to reconnect with their cultural roots. In these gatherings, food was more than nourishment. It became the centerpiece of memory, ritual, and unity. When a feast was called, whether in a humble village or a royal hall, the sights, smells, and sounds transformed the daily monotony into an occasion of wonder. Imagine the anticipation. Villagers carrying baskets of bread, pots of ale, and wheels of cheese. Noble kitchens bustling with cooks preparing roasts and pies. Children sneaking glimpses of the tables laden with rare treats. Festivals were an escape from the hunger of winter and the labor of summer, reminding all that even in a harsh land, there were times for laughter and plenty. Among the most important communal feasts were those tied to the agricultural calendar. The Celtic seasonal festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad carried over into medieval times, layered with Christian meaning yet still rooted in ancient rhythms. Samhain, held at the end of October, marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. Food for Samhain was both a celebration and an offering, with apples, nuts, grains, and preserved meat shared among families and also left for spirits and ancestors. Lugnasad, at the start of August, was a festival of the first fruits, where communities rejoiced at the bounty of fresh grain and bread. In these gatherings, the simple act of breaking bread together symbolized survival and renewal. As fires burned bright against the evening sky, music filled the air, and food was passed hand to hand. The boundaries between rich and poor blurred for a brief moment of shared humanity. Religious feasts also structured medieval Irish life, for Christianity infused the calendar with holy days that demanded communal celebration. Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days each brought with them customs that centered around food. Christmas might see even the poorest families stretch their supplies for a small but special meal. Extra butter for the bread, a piece of meat if it could be afforded, or a sweet treat flavored with honey. For the wealthy, Christmas banquets were opportunities to display generosity, often inviting poorer neighbors into the hall to share in a warm meal. Easter carried its own symbols, with eggs and lamb becoming part of the festive table. Saints' days provided excuses for fairs and markets, where food and drink became abundant, traded, and consumed in joy. Each feast, whether sacred or seasonal, transformed the table into a stage of memory, faith, and identity. When a feast was held in a noble household, the spectacle was as important as the food itself. Great halls were decorated with greenery, banners, and sometimes even fresh rushes laid across the floor to provide a clean surface. Long tables were prepared, often with the most prestigious guests seated closest to the Lord, while retainers and servants filled the lower benches. Roasted meats, pork, venison, and poultry were carried in with ceremony, sometimes accompanied by trumpets or music. Spiced dishes or sweetmeats, rare luxuries, were served to demonstrate the wealth and reach of the host. For nobles, festivals were not only about joy but also about power. To feed generously was to declare authority, and to let guests leave with full bellies was to weave a net of loyalty and gratitude. Yet even in these lofty halls, the essential joy of shared food remained. The warmth of firelight mingling with the scent of roasting meat, the sound of harps and fiddles lifting spirits into the night. For the peasants, feasting had a more intimate, yet equally powerful meaning. After long months of labor, the chance to gather with neighbors and family, to eat more than the daily bread and broth, was a treasured memory. A large cauldron might be filled with stew made from vegetables, herbs, and, on rare occasions, a cut of meat contributed by those who could spare it. Ale would be poured freely, often brewed specially for the occasion. Simple as the food may have been, the experience of eating together transformed it into something grand. Jokes, stories, and songs passed around the fire gave the meal flavor beyond its humble ingredients. For children, festivals were often the only times they tasted sweet treats, perhaps a honey cake or baked bread flavored with herbs. For adults, it was a brief reprieve from hunger, a reminder that life was not only survival, but also celebration. Music, storytelling, and poetry were inseparable from these festive gatherings. In noble halls, bards and harpers played to honor the lineage of their patrons, weaving tales of ancestors, victories, and great kings. In villages, local singers and storytellers kept alive the legends of heroes, spirits, and ancient gods. Between songs, dances broke out, men and women moving in circles, children mimicking their elders with laughter. The music gave rhythm to the night, while the stories tied the present to the past. As much as bread and meat filled the body, song and tale filled the spirit, reminding the people of who they were and where they came from. Feasts and festivals, then, were not only about food, but about memory and identity, anchoring medieval Irish society in a shared narrative of joy and endurance. Importantly, these communal meals and celebrations blurred the boundaries of class, at least for a short while. Though nobles dined on richer fare and peasants on simpler stew, the act of eating in proximity, of joining in song and laughter, created a sense of shared belonging. Festivals allowed for moments when the hierarchy softened, when even the Lord might toss a coin or a piece of bread to a child of the village, and when the poor might raise a cup of ale and sing alongside their betters. These gatherings reinforced bonds of community, eased tensions, and gave hope in a world where hunger and hardship were always close. In a society shaped by uneven wealth, festivals were the moments when the weight of difference lifted just enough for joy to breathe through the cracks. And when the night drew on, when the fire burned lower and the last of the food was gone, people carried home not just the memory of taste, but the memory of warmth, laughter, and music. In the darkened huts of the peasants, children fell asleep with bellies full and dreams sweetened by rare treats. In the stone halls of the nobles, guests retired with the satisfaction of having been fed and entertained. Festivals lingered long after they ended, becoming stories retold at hearthsides and memories clutched close during the lean days that followed. Food and song, once shared, echoed like a promise that hardship would always be broken by moments of joy, that the community would endure together. And so, medieval Irish festivals were not only the highlights of the calendar, but the anchors of spirit, ensuring that even amid hunger and toil, there was always a reason to gather, to eat, and to sing. The life of food in medieval Ireland was not confined to kitchens or farmyards alone. Much of it flowed outward, into the spaces where people gathered, marketplaces that pulsed with chatter, color, and barter, and monasteries that served as both spiritual havens and centers of production. To imagine this world, let us wander together into the cobbled lanes of a small Irish town on market day. The air feels damp with morning mist, but ahead of us there is already movement, the thrum of voices, the clip of hooves, the calls of hawkers selling their wares. For the peasant who has carried butter, cheese, or a basket of eggs, this market is not just a place to sell food, but a lifeline, the chance to trade for salt, cloth, or tools that cannot be made at home. And for the buyer, whether a fellow villager, a noble steward, or a monk sent on errands, it is the place where food networks link together, weaving the fragile tapestry of survival. Markets in medieval Ireland were smaller than the grand fairs of continental Europe, yet they were no less essential. Picture the long tables of rough timber, laden with loaves of dense barley bread, wedges of hard white cheese, small clay pots of honey that glisten in the pale light. Beside them, baskets of onions, leeks, and carrots spill over, the earthy smell clinging to the air. There is no abundance here, no overflowing cornucopia as in paintings of later feasts, but rather a modest display of what the land and season could spare. Yet even this modesty speaks of care, of the effort of countless hands who sowed, tended, and harvested. To walk between the stalls is to walk among human stories. A widow selling milk to keep her children fed, a fisherman offering salted herring after days at sea, a young couple bargaining for seeds in hope of next year's crop. There were also traveling merchants who brought a taste of the wider world. From them, townsfolk might see unusual goods, a pouch of imported salt from the coast of Brittany, a flask of French wine, or a small parcel of pepper so rare that it seemed like magic. These items, too precious for ordinary peasants, often found their way to the tables of lords and monasteries. Yet even the sight of them stirred wonder. Imagine the sensation of touching a wrinkled peppercorn, its sharp scent cutting through the familiar smells of smoke and damp wool. For many, these exotic flavors remained forever out of reach, but they carried whispers of lands beyond the horizon, connecting the humblest Irish village to the great currents of medieval trade. No less important than the marketplace were the monasteries, which dotted the Irish landscape like anchor points of both faith and community. These were not only centers of prayer and learning, but also hubs of agricultural skill. Within their stone walls, monks tended herb gardens where sage, thyme, and parsley grew in neat rows. They cultivated orchards of apples and pears, brewed ale in oak barrels, and churned butter from the milk of their herds. To step into a monastery's cloister was to smell the fragrance of rosemary drifting on the air, or to hear the quiet bubbling of ale fermenting in casks. In these spaces, food was not merely sustenance, but an extension of devotion. To eat well, in moderation, was to honor the Creator. The monasteries also played a crucial role in feeding the poor. On designated days, food would be distributed at the gates to beggars and travelers, a practice that bound the spiritual mission of charity to the earthly need of hunger. Envision a line of weary faces outside the gate, a mother with a child on her hip, an old man leaning on a stick, a wandering bard with little more than his harp. Each receives a small piece of bread, perhaps a ladle of pottage, and though it is not much, it is something. For many, these monastic kitchens provided their only hope in lean times. And so monasteries became known not only as places of prayer, but as hearths where the community's hunger met with kindness. The exchange of food in these markets and monasteries was more than a matter of trade or charity. It was a rhythm that shaped the bonds of medieval Irish life. A woman might trade her surplus butter for wool to make clothing. A fisherman might bring barrels of salted herring inland in return for oats. A monk might barter ale for honey. Each act of exchange bound people together, linking households and parishes into a shared web of reliance. Food, in this way, was never solitary. It flowed outward, carrying with it stories of hardship, generosity, and hope. Even festivals and church days transformed markets into gatherings of abundance. On feast days, stalls were decorated more brightly, and more unusual goods appeared: sugared almonds, sweet cakes, perhaps a jug of mead flavored with herbs. Monasteries would provide bread and ale in larger measure, reminding the people of a balance between fasting and feasting. Music filled the streets, children darted between stalls, and the air smelled rich with roasting meats. In these moments, food became a language of joy, a celebration of survival against the ever-present shadow of hunger. As night descended over a medieval Irish town, the marketplace emptied. Wooden tables were folded, baskets carried home, and the voices faded into the silence of darkening streets. Yet the traces lingered, the scent of herbs on the ground, the faint stickiness of honey spilled from a broken jar. The memory of conversations struck across the day. In the monasteries, lamps glowed softly in the refectories, where monks shared their evening bread and ale in quiet prayer. Both spaces, the bustling market and the solemn monastery, stood as twin pillars of the medieval food world, one earthly and noisy, the other sacred and calm. Together, they ensured that life went on, one meal at a time. When we think of medieval Irish life, it is easy to picture hardship, fields heavy with mud, hunger during winter, or the endless rhythm of toil. Yet there were also moments of light, moments where food became more than sustenance. It became a symbol, a shared ritual, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Festivals marked the passing of time, the turning of seasons, and the milestones of human life. In these moments, the food laid upon the table spoke a language far older than words, filled with meaning and memory. Consider the Feast of Samhain, the ancient festival that marked the end of harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. For medieval Irish folk, this was more than a celebration. It was a threshold, a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead thinned. Around the fire, families shared the last of the season's fresh produce: apples, nuts, roasted meats, and breads flavored with herbs. These foods were not merely eaten, they were offered, set aside for ancestors, or cast into the fire as gifts to unseen spirits. In the flickering light of the hearth, every bite carried weight. To taste the apple was to taste the closing of summer. To drink the ale was to feel the strength of the harvest preserved in liquid form. Other Christian holy days wove themselves seamlessly into the older fabric of ritual. On Easter, eggs took on symbolic power, representing new life and resurrection. In some villages, decorated eggs were exchanged, or even buried at the edges of fields as blessings for fertility. Christmas, too, was marked with food, not the sugar-laden feasts of modern times, but with what little could be spared: salted meats, loaves of bread baked with care, and ale shared among neighbors. These meals were not lavish, but they were communal, binding families together in hope and joy as the coldest months pressed in. Rituals also touched the smaller cycles of life: births, weddings, and funerals. At the birth of a child, neighbors might bring food to the family, most often bread and butter, as if to say, "Here is life. Here is nourishment for the mother who has labored." At weddings, honeyed drinks, mead, were sometimes shared, giving rise to the idea of the honeymoon, a sweet month after the ceremony when fertility and prosperity were prayed for. Funerals, by contrast, often involved food laid out for mourners, sometimes even bread and drink for the departed soul itself. In these ways, food accompanied people at every step, marking transitions with both physical and spiritual sustenance. The symbolism of food extended deep into the landscape itself. Grain, for example, was more than a crop. It was life, renewal, and the very heart of survival. To spill grain was unlucky. To store it securely was a sign of wisdom. Similarly, cattle were not only sources of milk and meat, but symbols of wealth, power, and divine favor. Ancient Irish law texts, the Brehon Laws, even tied compensation and honor prices to cattle. So to eat beef at a feast was to taste prestige itself. Honey carried its own power, golden and sweet. It symbolized abundance, the favor of nature, and sometimes divine blessing. Each food held layers of meaning, as if every bite connected earth, body, and spirit. Festivals in villages and towns brought these layers of meaning to life. During great feasts, storytellers recited old sagas, weaving together myth and meal. A bowl of pottage was not just barley and vegetables, but a reminder of the humble meals eaten by heroes in their wanderings. Roasted meat spoke of warriors and cattle raids, tales of triumph and loss. Bread, broken and passed from hand to hand, became a quiet act of unity. And ale, shared from one jug, sealed the bonds of kinship and community. These gatherings, echoing with music, song, and laughter, turned food into memory. Memory that could outlast the hunger of a single winter. Even the act of fasting held symbolic power. On holy days, abstaining from certain foods was seen as a way to purify the soul, to draw closer to God. Meat might be forbidden, replaced with fish, grains, and vegetables. For peasants, who often had little meat anyway, fasting was less a restriction than a recognition of their everyday life. Yet for nobles and monks, who might enjoy richer fare, fasting was a deliberate humbling, a way of stripping down to the essentials. In this sense, even the absence of food became meaningful, a ritual meal of emptiness, heavy with spiritual weight. The year itself was divided by festivals tied to food and the land. Imbolc in February, linked with Saint Bridget, celebrated the first stirrings of spring, when milk flowed more freely from cows and butter making began anew. Lugnasad, in August, marked the first harvest of grain, celebrated with games, songs, and the baking of special breads. Each festival was both a prayer and a thanksgiving, a way of acknowledging the fragile balance of survival. To eat at these times was to give thanks not just to God, but to the land, the cattle, the weather, and all the unseen forces that made food possible. When we step back and look at this rhythm of food, festival, and meaning, a picture emerges. Food was never just food. It was life itself, wrapped in layers of memory and belief. It was the taste of the earth, the blessing of the heavens, the bond of kinship, and the echo of ancestors. In medieval Ireland, every loaf of bread, every jug of ale, every roasted joint of meat was touched with story and spirit. To eat was to live, but to share food was to belong, to community, to history, and to the sacred cycles of the world. And so, as the fires of the feast died down, as songs faded into the quiet of night, people carried with them not just full bellies, but a sense of connection. Tomorrow would bring its struggles, work in the fields, the threat of hunger, the weight of survival. But for now, in the glow of shared meals and rituals, there was comfort, there was meaning, there was life made beautiful through food. And so, our journey through the kitchens and feasting halls of medieval Ireland draws to a close. We've seen how food shaped every part of life, the struggle of the poor, the wealth of the noble, the rituals of faith, and the joy of festivals where communities gathered as one. In the end, food was more than nourishment. It was memory, belonging, and the rhythm of the seasons. It was the taste of survival, the comfort of sharing, and the quiet reminder that even in the hardest times, people found meaning and beauty in the simple act of eating together. As the fires of the feast die down and the songs of the past fade into silence, I invite you to drift deeper into rest. Carry with you the warmth of those long-ago meals, the laughter of shared tables, and the peace of knowing that across centuries, food has always been our most human bond. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, and may you awaken with the quiet strength of those who came before.